this market. So what it means is the employer, now we have to whisper because we are heretics if we believe in it. The employer is stealing the labor of the workers. Right? He's hiring the workers, he's giving employment, but in the process of hiring the workers, he's also stealing their labor. That's the source of the profits of the employer. That's the source of the surplus that the employer gets. If there is, that is the source of the self-expansion of capital in modern capital. Without that, there is no it's not magic. You know, is self-expansion happening magically? No, it has to happen through some material process. And the material process that Marx discovers by entering into the hidden abode of production is that, you know, the employer is extracting more labor, more value than what the workers are getting paid. And that difference is what he calls as surplus value. In German, a true translation is more. And that more is nothing but a theft. Marx says that. The moment you say, what are the implications for the system? It has radical implications. Right? The system, the entire capitalist system with all its, you know, beautiful built environment, with all its magnificent structures, all its beauty and ugliness, whatever, you know, the magnificence of capitalism, Marx admits that, you know, there's been no system like this, right, which has expanded so quickly, which has produced so many commodities, which has produced so many things, right, which has increased the affluence of general societies, if not everybody. We'll talk about that later. So what Marx is saying is the moment you come to that understanding that the system is based on theft, nobody wants to accept it. Right? People who support the system don't want to accept it. And then, you know, this can create, you know, some people, some workers may hear about it. Oh, are you stealing our labor? We don't want you to steal our labor. We may politically organize and prevent you from doing it. Right? Political parties may form. There could be revolutions. There have been revolutions. Right? It's a simple idea. But it's not an easy idea. Right? It's not something that all the great mighty thinkers that Marx was referring to found. It was Marx's discovery. Right? So the system is based on theft. Right? The system is fundamentally unjust, so you have to fight the system. Right? So that's the second point I wanted to make. But then, you know, what are the various ways in which this theft happens? That's the third point. And Marx gives you three very important ideas in volume 1 of Capital, and he gives one more idea in volume 2. But let me cross my brief, exceed my brief, and also talk about volume 2, you know, to talk about that fourth method of extracting that surplus. So the first thing that he talks about is what he calls as absolute surplus value, right? Or he also talks about it in the context of the working day, right? He says the working day can be divided into two parts, right? One part, the worker is working in order to pay himself or herself, right? Whatever he or she is being paid. He calls that necessary labor. But then, you know, as you extend the working day, everything over and above necessary labor or necessary part of that working day goes into the pockets of the capitalist. That's surplus labor. Right? So when the capitalist buys labor power, when you buy a pen, or when you buy a shirt, or when you buy a two-wheeler, or whatever you want to buy, when you buy something, does it belong to you? Do you keep it? Do you possess it? Do you take it home? You do, right? You say, when somebody tries to take it, you say, it's mine. I paid the money for it. What does the capitalist do? I bought this labor power, it belongs to me. I own this labor power. What is the problem though? Labor power is embedded in the body of the worker. Right? If it is embedded in the body of the worker, did the capitalist buy the worker? Is the worker the slave of the capitalist? In capitalism, no. In slavery, yes, but in capitalism, no. You are free. You think you are free. Right? So, the worker protests, saying you don't own me, you only own labor power. So that creates, you know, an ambiguous zone of contestation. How long should the working day be? Capitalist says, I own you for 24 hours. I bought labor power, I want to keep it for 24 hours. Worker says, I need sleep, I need leisure, I need whatever, you know, to go and support my family, I need some entertainment, right? I need to commute from home to work. All of this takes time. So I cannot give you my entire time. Capitalist says, I bought your entire time. So what does it produce? There's a whole chapter, probably the longest chapter in Kapital, on the working day. It produces what is known as class struggle. Right? Working day, you know, the length of the work day becomes a major aspect of the struggle. This is one example of class struggle. Capitalist says, I want to extend it, you know, I want to keep you for 12 hours, 13 hours, 14 hours. And the worker keeps resisting that. Right? So, so sometimes, you know, workers go and petition the state. The state has to respond because, especially in democracies, or, you know, even in non-democracies, where, you know, there is need for legitimacy, like today's China, you know, you have to respond to demands of the majority. Right? So, when workers, who are the majority of any society, demand that, you know, you can't have all our time, through struggles, you know, there is a legislation around the work day. You know, is it 9 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours? Then you have a 2-day weekend. You know, all these are products of class struggle. Right? The length of the work day, the, you know, the extent of the week, you know, all these are, you know, these are not given by the, you know, good-natured capitalists freely. They were results of class struggle, right? So this is what Marx calls as absolute surplus value. You know, worker needs to work for a certain number of hours to reproduce the value of what he or she is paid for, and the capitalist wants to take the rest of it, therefore wants to extend. So, you know, time is money. You know, when you hear that expression, this is what it means. More time means more profit. More time means more value. More time means more surplus for the capitalist. The other, you know, aspects of, you know, extraction of surplus, the second major thing Marx calls as relative surplus value. And relative surplus value is a particular concept where, suppose, you know, through legislation, you know, through class struggle, people fix the length of the work day as 9 hours or 10 hours. What do you do now? What does the capitalist do in order to extract more value? You can't extend the work day, it's illegal. You know, if you extend, cops can come and imprison you. What do you do then? You can cut the wages, but if you cut the wages, workers will go berserk. Right? In a situation where they have some strength, you know, where there are trade unions or where they have some strength. Let's say the capitalist cannot do it. What's the only other option? You could take more work, you could take more labor, not work, but, you know, you could take more labor in every minute or every hour, right? Or during the workday. How do you do that? So, if you are able to do that, I already told you the workday is divided into two parts, the necessary component and the surplus component. Somehow, if you are able to cut down the necessary component, then, you know, even if the workday is fixed, you get more of the surplus component. Right? How do you cut down the necessary component? Necessary component, remember, is the reproduction of the worker's necessaries. Right? How does the worker reproduce himself or herself? Through all the commodities that he or she purchases. Right? If you are somehow able to cheapen the commodities that the worker consumes, then, you know, you can cut down the necessary component. So how do you cheapen the commodities of commodities that workers consume?
By using more equipment, machineries?
By, you know, through technological growth. A broad answer is through technological dynamism, through technological growth. So something like technological dynamism, Marx is saying, is built into the system. Why is capitalism so dynamic? You know, Schumpeter talks about creative destruction, right? Why is the system so dynamic? Marx is saying there is a deep imperative of producing more surplus that drives the technological growth in the system. This is not there in feudalism, this is not there in slavery, right? But it's there in capitalism because, the capitalist is trying to cut down the necessary component of a workday. Right? If you improve technology, then you can produce things more cheaply, by improving the efficiency of production, and so there is an imperative to produce, cheaper and cheaper goods in the system, and that produces a whole lot of crises. I'll come to that later. The third aspect is what somebody was mentioning, which is in every hour you can also increase the intensity of labor. The effort that's extracted from the worker. How many of you have seen Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times? So that's a great example, right? Chaplin is working in a factory, and what is Chaplin doing? He's working in front of an assembly line, and the capitalist says, Chaplin is, fixing some bolts or something in the assembly line. He says, move it faster. Move the assembly line faster. So he suddenly, the line starts moving faster, and he can't cope with, the pace of the assembly line. So that's an example of increased intensity of labor. Right? In the same hour, you do more work. Right? So that's a third strategy that the capitalist can deploy, especially with technological improvements like having an assembly line and so forth. You could experiment with increasing the intensity. You make workers work harder during the same time, right? You cut down lunch time. That's another thing. Those of you who saw the film, that's another thing that they try to do. They try to scrap the lunch hour. They try to feed him while he is working, right? So that's also extracting more work during the workday, right? So that's the third strategy. The fourth strategy, which comes out in volume 2 of Capital, is you can articulate it in two different ways. One is what one could call as the cut down of turnover time. I'll explain what it is. Another way of saying this is production of space, and this is something that geographers like David Harvey picked up on, and developed very, very fascinating accounts of how capitalist societies work. So how does production of space help? So what Marx is arguing here is that if you look at the circuit of capital, right, capitalist starts with some amount of money, ends with a higher amount of money. In the middle, the capitalist has to acquire raw materials which have to be transported from all over the world, has to hire workers, then has to go through a process of production, and has to sell it in the market. Right? Each of these take time. Right? Each of these steps takes time. Now what Marx says is, if you can somehow find a way to cut down this time. Right? Suppose you start with capital M, and you need a year for the money to come back with some self-expansion. Suppose you can do it in 6 months. What happens? Your profits double. You finish the circuit in 6 months. What you are getting in 1 year earlier, now you are getting in 6 months. And if you have 2 turnovers in 1 year, then your profits double, and you get more surplus. So in order to do that, what do you do? To cut down these the turnover time that is involved in capitalism, what do? All the massive innovation in transportation, for instance. How do you quickly transport things? Right? How do you communication technologies? Right? How do you cut down the transfer of information, the time that it takes to transfer information? Right? Communication technologies, transportation. There's an inherent dynamism again, because what these technologies do is they cut down turnover time. And the capitalist is constantly trying to cut down turnover time in order to increase profits. This is the fourth strategy. So what Marx actually uses a very interesting term. He says there's an annihilation of space. There's a constant annihilation of space, or a space compression that happens because the capitalist wants to cut down turnover time. So he calls it annihilation of space through time. That's the short form of that, annihilation of space through time. And this is the fourth strategy. And what it does is, it brings things closer. Right? In 1950s, suppose you wanted to watch a cricket match, right? Could you watch the recent Women's World Cup final from home? Could you watch it from home in the 1950s? Let's say it happened in 1950s. You couldn't. You would read about it in the newspaper 2 days later. Today you can actually watch it in your living room or in your hostel TV room. Right? That's an example of how, space gets compressed. Right? Things become much closer. You can reach your destination much faster. It would take months to go to England or US earlier. Now you can go in less than a day. And there's this inherent dynamism to compress space or annihilate space within capital. Right? So, but it also produces greater surplus value. The drive always in all these four cases is to increase the surplus value. That's the third idea I wanted to tell you. The fourth is Marx basically was the originator of the theory of a firm. Why do firms exist? Did you ever think about it? In economics, I used to offer, I offered that elective once when I was teaching here, theory of the firm. Why do firms exist? Do you need a firm? Do you need an organizational form at all? Do you have markets? Why can't everything happen through markets? Why do you need an organization? Right? This is something that you would come across in advanced microeconomics. And Marx's answer to that question is, what happens in the markets is very different from what happens inside the firm. What you see in the markets is some kind of equal exchanging for equal. There is a laissez-faire, right? There is a certain voluntariness. Whenever you want to go to the market, you go, you buy. You want to sell labor power, you sell. You don't want to, you keep it with yourself, right? There's a voluntariness to this whole thing. But when you enter the firm, what's the structure there? Do you have laissez-faire inside the firm? All those people who condemn planning or command economy, what is happening? There's a certain fetishism of the markets. What happens inside a firm? How many of you have worked in a firm, internships or whatever? Nobody. Very few, okay. What happens inside a firm? You have a command economy, you have a hierarchy inside a firm. Right? There's a very clearly defined hierarchy. Power flows from top to bottom. Right? That's not what happens in the market. Inside the firm, you have a command economy. All those people who attack command economies have to wonder why, one of the deepest, most core components of capitalism, is structured along a command economy line. Right? So, it's a very clear hierarchy of power. It's a totally different structure than what happens in the markets. Right? Think about how the firm functions. Is there planning that happens inside the firm? All the time. They plan how much to market, they, in terms of the produce. They plan how much to, where to source things from. They plan everything, where to source workers from. Where to buy labor power, where to buy raw materials. Constantly all kinds of, So a firm is a planned entity, is a command economy. Very different from what happens inside the market. Marx's answer to the question of why firms exist is, firms allow cooperation, right? A lot of people can be brought together, and in cooperation you actually see a higher productivity emerging. Firms allow for division of labor. Marx actually clarifies that, Smith's understanding of division of labor from the pin factory example was confused, right? Smith's example doesn't make the distinction between internal division of labor and social division of labor. Right? Marx actually uses the Indian caste system to talk about social division of labor, rightly or wrongly. We could debate that, but he uses the Indian story to talk about social division of labor. What happens inside a firm is based on internal division of labor, right? So he makes that distinction. So firms allow for division of labor, and firms allow for the introduction of machinery, right? Large-scale machinery, economies of scale, and it doesn't talk about agglomeration economies, because agglomeration economies is how multiple firms exist in one site, and just the fact that multiple firms, multiple kinds of workers exist in one city, how does it produce greater efficiency? And David Harvey makes a very interesting point that Marx's understanding of factories and how cooperation processes, this division of labor, it all came from the city of Manchester, right, which was like the cradle of capitalism, right? That's where capitalism first emerged, industrial capitalism emerged. But if we had gone a few kilometers away and went to the city of Birmingham, the same industrial capitalism was developing differently. Why did Marx focus on Manchester? One, it was, it was like the first capitalist city of the world in many ways, industrial capitalist city. But it was also a city where Engels, right, set up his factory. Marx learned a lot about how factories function. Engels owned a textile factory. So, Marx learned a lot of how factories worked from Engels. Even though it's single authored, there's a lot of Engels in Kapital. But most of these ideas Marx sharpened and developed further. That's why it's single authored. So what you have from those chapters, in the middle of Kapital, is Marx is articulating a theory of the firm, and is basically saying a firm exists because surplus value can be created, right? And capitalists can extract surplus value from the workers through a command structure, right? Through a structure of hierarchy, through a very efficient kind of planning model, they can extract the value from workers, right? Surplus value from workers. So he has a theory of the firm. Of course, when you read, I don't know how many of you have seen Ronald Coase's work. Ronald Coase, Theory of the Firm, you will read it at some point. Well, he also talks about the firm having a command economy. Right? It's very interesting. A lot of neoclassical economists repeat what Marx had articulated in some text or the other, but they never acknowledged. And then people went on to find that, they had made copious notes from Marx's Capital, including Keynes, who publicly denied having ever read Marx. But, in his diaries, people found circuits of Capital and careful discussions of how the circuits evolved and so forth. Anyway, that's a different point. So, so there is a theory of the firm, that is embedded in this text, right? And there are a couple of other things which I'll quickly mention, and then I'll conclude. The fifth point that I wanted to make is, Marx had a theory of the business cycle. So one of the earliest originators of the idea of business cycle, and he uses the logic of the reserve army of labor, industrial reserve army of labor, in order to talk about the business cycle. He talks about how the reserve army expands and contracts from time to time, based on how the economy, the larger economy is performing, and the expansion and the contraction of the reserve army also produces these expansions and contractions of the larger economy, right? So he explained it, and in particular, there's something about the discussion of the reserve army that is relevant even for the contemporary developing economies, including the Indian economy. He talks about I'm assuming all of you know what a reserve army is. It's the army, or it's all those unemployed people in a capitalist society. And he talks about three kinds of reserves. He talks about floating reserves, people who are in and out of the labor market. He talks about latent reserves. These are people in agriculture who are yet to be integrated into capitalist markets, labor markets. And there's a deep echo of the only African or a black man to win the Nobel Prize, Arthur Lewis, right? The Lewisian model is all about the latent reserves, and there's a deep insight in the discussion on latent reserves that Lewis picks up on and develops into the unlimited supplies of labor model later on. That won him the Nobel Prize later. There's also a third kind of reserves, which he calls as stagnant reserves. So you have floating reserves, latent reserves, and stagnant reserves. And the idea of stagnant reserves, people have used all kinds of expressions. Have you heard of this expression called informal economy? Right? People who are within a larger capitalist economy, but people who are outside, the formal capitalist structure. Right? So Marx is hinting at that. He is observing London and Manchester of the 1850s and 1860s, and he's saying that there's a large informal economy. He's saying there are all these stagnant reserves, who are not integrated into capitalist production processes very directly, right? So you have multiple kinds of reserves. He also talks about destitutes as a fourth category, people who are not integrated, people who, if there is no welfare state, they have no, way of reproducing themselves, right? So he talks about these four categories in the context of the reserve army. But the expansion and contraction of the reserve army, through all these different categories, also helps you understand how, growth can accelerate and growth can decelerate, right, within capitalist economies. The last idea from Kapital that I want to talk about is the last section that Marx devotes Kapital to, which is, the idea of primitive accumulation. Right? And the idea of primitive accumulation is, as Marx says, it's the original accumulation of capital. And so how did these two classes, Marx says that capital is a social relation. So how did the class of capitalists come into being? How did the class of workers come into being? Right? And how did capitalists suddenly possess all this capital through which you could hire the workers? And Marx says, although capital is fundamentally about the way the capitalist economies function, the deeper story is, power is central to how capitalism came into being. The origins of capitalism, to use Marx's own expression, are written in letters of blood and fire. He says, he talks about the enclosure movement as an example of how people were kicked out of their lands. Peasants were kicked out of their lands, how their lands were enclosed. And, people left without any livelihood, were forced into, a migration process which took them to small towns or, cities. And, once industries and factories started emerging, in the middle, of course, once they were kicked out and before industries emerged, they were a nuisance to these towns and cities. So, all kinds of legislation were created to discipline them, to control them. Vagrant laws were created during that period. This is something Marx goes into great detail. So there's an internal process of dispossessing people, that creates capital, right? So as a group of people begin to own some of these resources that belong to small producers, or when commons are privatized, or when public properties are privatized, like your public sector firms which are sold at, that's an example of primitive accumulation. So he says, internally these are the processes, but externally there's a very different process that he talks about, which is, imperialism or colonialism. He never uses the term imperialism, but colonialism becomes a particular route through which, tribute is extracted from all these multiple colonies, which serves as capital for the emerging capitalist class in England, right? So you have both internal sources and external sources, and through the public debt that is created, through the credit system. He talks about multiple mechanisms through which, this process of primitive accumulation happens in England, because he takes the case study of England to illustrate his arguments. But David Harvey again uses this idea of primitive accumulation and brings it to more the contemporary times, and says that primitive accumulation doesn't just happen before capitalism comes into being. It's a strategy that the capitalists use even during advanced stages of capitalism. So for instance, the spate of privatizations that happened across the world in the last 30 years, 35 years, where the public has been decimated, right, and given away at very cheap prices to the public has been decimated and given away to the private players, this process, destruction of commons or disposition of small producers. We all see, examples like Singur or Nandigram, but, or several special economic zones all around Hyderabad or in Andhra Pradesh or, even the local regions. You can see this as, dimensions of the same phenomenon of primitive accumulation, which Harvey rewords as accumulation by disposition, right? So all these multiple processes, the 5-6 ideas that I talked about in Kapital, they're all relevant today. Have people overcome fetishism? Look at your economics textbooks, right? Outside political economy, you do have fetishism. You have these practices. Has that puzzle gone away? Marx put it at the very heart of his critique of capitalism. So the system is definitely based on theft, and the theft is something that drives the system. There is no curing of that. Any kind of reform program, it may alleviate the conditions of people, it may improve the wages of workers, but it's not going to answer the critique of Marx. That's why Marx is so terrible, right? So, because his critique cannot be answered within capitalism. So as long as you have capitalism, you will have Marx, right? That heretic. The third, the various ways in which surplus value is extracted, or the logic of the reserve army, or the theory of the firm. Why do firms exist? That logic, or the logic of primitive accumulation. Different components that I chose to highlight. So there's much more in this text. I taught it for a semester. I'm going to teach it in Amherst starting in September for a whole semester, but I try to summarize. But there are, the last point to conclude, there are 3 important, takeaway points from Kapital. And the first point is, about the injustice that is inherent in the system, right? When you have this thesis and antithesis coming together, capital and wage labor coming together, it produces a certain kind of inequality, right? So, and that inequality waxes and wanes. There are certain periods when inequality rises, there are certain periods when inequality declines. And Marx gives us a framework to understand that. And if you look at the last 30-40 years, inequality has expanded across almost every space in the world. Thomas Piketty, worked on US and France to show how these 2 countries have become extremely unequal. Several people have worked on China. I'm currently writing a book on class and inequality in China and India. Chinese inequality has gone through the roof. If you incorporate the top incomes in China, China is more unequal than US today. It's bizarre, but it still calls itself a communist country. Indian economy has become extremely unequal during the same period, for the last 30 years. This is a story that's true across the world. And I'm basically arguing in this book that, using Marx's categories, Marx's method, that ascent from simple abstractions to the concrete, how you move from categories like rural and